Uno, dos, uno, dos.
Probando inglés. Inglés, probando inglés. Bien. Avise. Carlos, inglés, ¿me oye? Inglés, inglés, probando. Lo que pasa es que en los micrófonos aparece el nombre del idioma en el menú, no el canal, no el número del canal. Ok, inglés. Bien, me paso a español ahora.
Sí, se oye. Sí.
Entonces, para la segunda consola, inglés, inglés, bien. Quique, no me has dicho nada. Ah, no, yo espero, yo espero.
and your organization. And we appreciate everyone's presence. I'm Julissa Mantilla Falcon. I'm a commissioner and rapporteur for El Salvador and issues of women's issues and memory and justice. I'm accompanied by Commissioner Jose Luis Caballero, the rapporteur for human mobility and human rights and justice. And I also welcome the presence of Tania Renaud, the executive secretary, and the assistant Executive Secretary Maria Claudia Pulido. I'm going to explain the distribution of time. We'll begin with civil society, who will have 20 minutes. The state will have 20 minutes. Then the commission will have 20 minutes. And then there'll be a second round of interventions of 12 minutes each. Having said that, I give the floor to civil society.
Buenos días.
Good morning, Honorable Inter-American Commission on Human Rights and representatives of the Salvadorian government. I'm Veronica Reina, and together with the other organizations, we will describe the situation regarding forced disappearances in El Salvador. Wednesday, March 30th, 2022, the police detained Juan. His wife looked for him in at least 3 different police stations, but had no news of his whereabouts. Sunday, Sonia, his mother, arrived to bring food and hygiene articles and insisted on knowing where her son was. At the station, they advised her to go to the Human Rights Office and the Ombudsman. When she returned home that same day, a funeral home arrived to say that her son had died. The family turned to the Institute of Forensic Medicine to find out about her son. They told him that he had died on to severe contusions and trauma to the thorax. There were multiple blows to his body. They believe that before he died, he was tortured where he was detained. His mother insists that her son was never a gang member and was never involved in any criminal group. In September, Jesus Hoya found out that from that same office that his brother had been killed and died in a common grave. And when they asked for the morgue to show a photo of his brother, he found that it had been registered under the wrong name. Jesus had looked for his brother in different prisons and hospitals, but nobody gave him information on his whereabouts. According to the forensic office, his mother died because of a lung problem, but another person detained with him said he had been beaten and that he'd been vomiting blood. According to Jesus, his brother was beaten to death, but it could not be proven because his body had been thrown in a common grave. In April, they found that another family found that their son wasn't receiving his packages. Jesus said, "I want to give a message to all families who don't know where their family members are. I say, don't stop looking for them. I never stopped asking about my brother, but in the end I found that he had died. We don't know how many more families could have this situation happen to them. Such cases are common knowledge thanks to the work of the media and victims and human rights organizations. The Salvadoran government has minimized and denied these facts and failed to investigate them. In most cases, they say that there is no official charge. The fear means that these institutions co-opted by the executive branch mean that a report does not mean that there will be any justice, and victims have presented their claims to the prosecutor's office and other oversight agencies, such as the Special Human Rights Prosecutor. The state of emergency that began in March of 2022 has been extended for the 20th time just days ago. It has generated thousands of claims of human rights violations, arbitrary detentions, extrajudicial killings, torture. Families are looking for hundreds of disappeared people. They don't know what their health is, whether they're still alive. The families of disappeared persons are experiencing ongoing torture, and it's caused by the Salvadoran government because they're denied information or because the government isn't penalizing these serious human rights violations. We will now provide information, detailed information on forced disappearances under the state of emergency in El Salvador. Good morning, honorable commissioners, everyone present here. 7 human rights organizations show that between March of 2022 and September of 2023, there were 5,775 victims of human rights violations because of the state of emergency. These numbers reflected widespread abuses affecting tens of thousands of people. During the special regime, human rights organizations have made 327 reports of disappearances, and 85% of the victims are men, 15% are women. 71% are between 18 and 35 years of age. These forced disappearances were preceded by arbitrary arrests by police or military officers, and then information on whereabouts are subsequently denied. This can go on for months. We have found cases where there have been up to 8 months without the authorities giving any information about the prison where their loved ones are detained. Many people detained under this state of emergency are still considered disappeared. We've verified that in many cases the prison authorities provide false information on the whereabouts of individuals, sending family members to the wrong place. There are cases where the whereabouts are known for a time, but then the family members are said that it's no longer clear where the person is. The many mothers, families of forced people who have been disappeared because of the state of emergency have to go from different police station to police station, hospitals, funeral parlors, hospitals, trying to find out where their loved ones are, and they never get a good answer from the government. Cristosala found that there are 4 cases of people who died under detention and were later disappeared under custody of the state. There are 3 men and 1 woman whose bodies were found in public cemeteries. These individuals were just thrown in unmarked graves or with the wrong names and not without proper processes. Families were not notified of the whereabouts or of the deaths of these individuals. They had to do their own investigating, visiting morgues, etc. We found that 3 of these deaths are tied to suspicions of physical violence, so it is believed that these are cases of extrajudicial killings. Very likely these people who suffer forced disappearances have suffered or are suffering torture and cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment. We have verified through documentary photographic evidence and witness testimony and field investigations that the practice of torture under this regime is a constant in different atrocious modalities that have come to the knowledge of this Honorable Commission before. In this context, many detained people have died under this regime and under the custody of the state. Christos has identified that hundreds of people have died under these circumstances. 8 women, 2 babies who could not tolerate the inhuman conditions. Many of the bodies of these victims had signs of physical violence, so the likelihood that they were subject to extrajudicial killing is also high. These abuses happen with absolute impunity and are widespread because of the reform to criminal and prison laws and the practices of officials and prosecutors applying this new regime. The basic rule of due judicial process does not apply to those who are detained under the state of emergency, including people who have suffered or are currently disappeared. Habeas corpus does not work for them either. In reviewing the data, we see that over 5,000 habeas corpus claims were brought forward from 2021 to 2022, and by 2023, none of them had been resolved. Only 5 had been admitted. The human rights defense prosecutor is not fulfilling its role, is not protecting and defending victims from these terrible acts. Carlos, a young 22-year-old, disappeared January 1st, 2022 when he went out running. With the lack of progress on investigation by the authorities, his mother and family members have dedicated every single day to finding him by any means at their hand. They still don't know where he is. I'm Gabriela Santo from the UCA Human Rights Institute. I'll refer to disappearances committed by non-state agents. Disappearance under the state of emergency are given in a situation of constant impunity. The failure to meet the state's obligations for disappeared persons disappeared by gangs. Arbitrary detentions under the state of emergency do not mean that justice is guaranteed for those who are disappeared and their family members. Disappearances in Salvador are not anything new. A number of investigations by human rights organizations reveal that killing and dismembering by gangs has been used to hide these acts and to maintain impunity. We see evidence of torture of victims, hiding the bodies. Experience shows that when people don't show up in the first week, the most likely thing is that they have been victims of homicide, femicide. And though we don't know how many people have been disappeared in El Salvador owing to the lack of a single record, based on these organizations estimate that state institutions have received at least 6,400 reports of disappearances, mostly perpetrated by gangs. And of those, over 2,000, about 37%, are still active cases. According to our records, victims of these disappearances are mostly young or adolescent males who refuse to join the gangs, don't want to collaborate in their acts or live in a place controlled by such a gang. But since gangs are criminal, violent structures, mostly male, they also disappear women and girls. We have many documented cases. The motives for these disappearances are manifold, but they are based on gender vengeance, refusal to associate with the gang or associating with rival gangs, reprisals over breakups, etc. And it's not random. The victims are selected in advance, and then they are kidnapped, and then there is killing, sexual violence, and hiding of the bodies. The opaque policy of the government makes it impossible to get information on these disappearances and killings. They classify information without legal grounds. For decades, gangs were the main perpetrators of disappearances in the country, and although this has declined in recent months, the government is now the main perpetrator of disappearances under the state of emergency. State institutions mustn't become criminal actors replacing the actions of gangs in the territory. Disappearances of persons, regardless of who does it, should be prevented, investigated, and prosecuted in a timely manner, and always paying attention to the needs of the victims. Juan was 26 when he disappeared on April 14th, 2018. He worked as a water delivery person for 5 years. The prosecutor's office has not told the family about progress on the case. His mother has had to do the search on her own, visiting various cemeteries, trying to find her daughter's body. I'm Victoria from DPLF. I work on the search for disappeared persons. In recent years, the government has created special organizations, a unit, for instance, the unit for search of persons and others, but these instruments have not made any difference in preventing and resolving cases of disappeared persons. They're ineffective. We see failures such as the following. There's no record of disappeared persons. Even though disappearance of individuals in El Salvador is nothing new, there are no official data as to how many people have disappeared. They're not disaggregated by sex, age, etc., and it makes it difficult to understand the scope of the problem and to make public policy decisions. The data are fragmented across different institutions, and sometimes disappearances are recorded under a different category, such as kidnapping or deprivation of liberty. The immediate search is rarely conducted by the government. It's the families, especially the women, who do this. Families complain that prosecutors and the police ignore them and mistreat them when they present their cases. They continue to demand that they wait between 24 up to 72 hours before they make the report, or they say, oh, they'll show up again, and then are demeaning in other ways. And so families need to conduct the search on their own. Often it's women who have to do it, even though they're already in a precarious situation and are caregivers for their family. The participation of family members in the official search is blocked. And when the government does start searching, they don't provide information to families. The officials in charge show no empathy or respect for the family's pain. And there are many cases in which the prosecutors in charge of the investigation don't even accept visits by the family, don't answer their calls, sometimes block all forms of communication. In cases of searching for disappeared women, the gender perspective is not taken into account, and they don't consider the different kinds of structural gender violence, such as feminicide, human trafficking, etc., as motives. Persons have been disappeared under the state of emergency, as we have found from family, and the response from the prosecutor's office has been that investigations have been suspended because the priority is the state of emergency. Disappearances perpetrated by state agents under the state of emergency are not being investigated by the authorities. For all of the above reasons, we request this Honorable Commission to urge the Salvadoran government to 1. Publicly acknowledge the existence of disappearance as a phenomenon which involves government responsibility, and to avoid the stigmatization of families and communities who are searching for those people. 2, do not extend the state of emergency because it is facilitating arbitrary detentions that can lead to torture and forced disappearance, as we've seen and heard at this hearing. 3, update and ensure public access to the record of persons deprived of liberty, includes those detained under the state of emergency, and provide information to family members as to the whereabouts of their loved ones. 4, develop a public policy on disappearances that includes the creation of a national registry and discuss a general act on forced disappearances and a search commission. I have immediate search mechanisms that include families according to protocols and international standards, in addition to training staff to implement it. 6, pay special attention to the disappearance of women and ensure that searches include a gender perspective. Next, ratify the Inter-American Convention on Forced Disappearances of Persons and the International Convention on the Protection of All Individuals from Forced Disappearances. Lastly, we request that this commission continue to monitor the situation of human rights in El Salvador, owing to the serious deterioration of the democratic rule of law and given the serious human rights violations, it consider including El Salvador in Chapter 4B of its annual report.
Muchas gracias a la sociedad.
Thank you very much, civil society. You have 1 minute left, and the floor now goes to the state. Thank you. Our greetings to each of the commissioners and representatives of civil society organizations, as well as to the people of El Salvador. I'm Andres Guzman. I am the Presidential Commissioner for Human Rights and Freedom of Expression in El Salvador. I first wanted to reaffirm the respect that the Bukele administration has for human rights, as well as solidarity with the millions of victims of disappearances and violations of human rights committed by gang members. They have basically kidnapped an entire country for many years. Commissioners, El Salvador has been known for a number of different things globally. First, a civil war, which was a conflict between ideological extremes. Most of those who died were innocent civilians. Secondly, a lack of security, which has reached unbelievable heights. El Salvador, in terms of the gangs and who are criminal groups who have taken control, who had taken control of the entire country. They committed murders, kidnappings. They forcibly recruited young people, innocent children, in communities. They even threatened to detain them if they did not join the gangs. They extorted small businesses and led to many of those going bankrupt or closing down. They murdered those who worked in the public transportation system. For more than 20 years, El Salvador was in a state of total insecurity. This came out on the news, on TV, in different newspaper articles. We should never forget that every tattoo you see on a gang member represents a murder. Once there was a ceasefire between criminal groups, which became public policy in 2012, supported by the OAS, all that did was that they did not harm one another, but they started to terrorize the population. The disappearances and extortion increased exponentially. El Salvador was then labeled the most dangerous country in the world. More than 100,000 murders amongst students, police, military, and regular community members. It was 103 murders for every 100,000 inhabitants. Women, children, adolescents were the targets of these criminal groups. And the rate of homicides was very high. There were no reparations for the families of the victims, nor had international organizations taken a strong stand on this, who claim to care about human rights. The third thing for which El Salvador is known is very different. The Salvadoran people decided to dispense with all political parties that had been present during the war, and things started on a better path. And this is when the president issued an executive order on territorial control, meaning they were going to take away the power from the criminal organizations. There were 7 phases to this, and now El Salvador is the safest country in the Americas. This has been recognized internationally. All crimes committed by criminal groups reduced drastically. More than 72,000 terrorists and gang members have been rounded up, arrested, and are being brought to justice. Several have been released where it was decided that their cases could proceed without them in detention. This doesn't mean that every case has been dismissed. The police are weighing the evidence. More than 400 days without a single homicide under the administration of Bukele, and this makes El Salvador the safest country in the Americas. And we went from 103 murders per 100,000 inhabitants to 2.3. The extortions have been eliminated almost 100%, and other crimes have drastically diminished. The international community has recognized these efforts. Commissioners, this context is very important for this hearing. We have to have the premise that most of the disappearances in El Salvador have been at the hands of criminal gangs. The state is not the cause of this problem. We showed clear evidence that we were attacking this problem at its roots. We discovered that there was a link in the chain that we had not yet attacked. There was no specific crime on the books for disappearing a person, and also to find the remains of the person. There was a reform in 2019 in the criminal code for the crime of the disappearance of persons, and the implementation of the protocol in the search for disappeared persons in El Salvador, which establishes clear guidelines for each institution involved, beginning with the deployment of an investigative team by the state to do that, further establishing that there's no specific deadline for reporting the disappearance of an individual, because every single case has to be addressed and processed immediately. There are also specialized investigations in the case of disappearances and crimes against vulnerable persons, including children and adolescents. In the Office of the Attorney General, there are special units to address cases on disappeared persons, and particularly women, children, adolescents, and other vulnerable groups. We have included gender perspective in all efforts by state institutions, and there's special attention paid to cases of women, adolescents, children, and other vulnerable groups. We have seen incredible results. From 2013 to 2019, there were hundreds of cases per year. As I was saying, 103 murders per 100,000 inhabitants. And starting in 2020 through October 2023, it's 90 per year. That is a rate of 4 per 100,000 inhabitants. There have been allegations of forced disappearances during the state of emergency. This is patently false. There is a clear distinction between crimes having to do with the disappearance of persons. One of the articles in our criminal code criminalizes the forced disappearance of individuals, and particularly when public authorities are involved. Another article of the criminal code which criminalizes forced disappearance in the case that are caused by private individuals. It is there are cases where they may or may not have acted under the instructions of a government official. There is no statute of limitations for investigations in this, but there are false accusations of forced disappearance during the state of emergency continue to persist. In 2023, the Office of the Public Prosecutor has not received a single report of this type of crime. They do not exist, and in our text, there have not been forced disappearances perpetrated by the state. In El Salvador, we have mechanisms for providing timely information about those who have disappeared. We provide individuals with all possible guarantees. Therefore, it will be important to hear from Ernest Escobar, who is our Prosecutor General, who will share information with you so that you are apprised of what is being done. Commissioners, the NGOs who discuss these types of disappearances are just seeking to attack the government, and they're doing they're taking advantage of the fact that we're in the midst of a campaign. The leaders of these NGOs are from other political parties and that spread propaganda. They are to strengthen the gangs, and they're camouflaged as political parties and NGOs. They enjoy impunity vis-a-vis the Salvadoran people. Only the state has real data on what is being done. What is not official is not credible. It is baseless. These data do not come from official sources. The administration of Bukele has been able to do away with kidnappings, forced disappearance, gang activity. We have created a new country, a new El Salvador. I will wrap up with this video that shows in the news what is happening in El Salvador these days. And now I will turn the floor over to my colleague.
¿Nos pueden ayudar a correr el video, por favor?
Dolor tan grande quitarme un pedazo de mi vida. Niña. Ay, Señor.
En la quema del microbús de la Ruta 47 de Mexicanos, registrado el 20 de junio de 2010, hecho que dejó 17 fallecidos y 12 personas quemadas.
¡Malditos asesinos! Se deleitan ustedes matando sangre inocente.
El jueves, los cadáveres de 8 trabajadores de una empresa de electricidad que realizaban labores de mantenimiento cerca de donde fueron asesinados. Más tarde, otros 3 cuerpos fueron hallados en una plantación de caña de azúcar y se presume que eran jornaleros que trabajaban en la zona.
Solo en las últimas 48 horas se registraron 4 masacres en las que murieron ancianos, mujeres, jóvenes y una bebé de 8 meses de edad. Desde hace 25 años, las pandillas salvadoreñas libran una batalla por el control del país, lo que ha convertido a El Salvador en una de las naciones con mayor criminalidad en el mundo.
¡Ay, no, Dios mío, qué dolor! ¡Papito lindo!
Un pueblo entero llora ante la muerte brutal que sufrieron 5 miembros de una familia.
El problema más común en El Salvador, donde el flagelo de las maras no se detiene. Una familia se vio obligada a abandonarlo todo por la amenaza de los pandilleros.
Llevan lo que pueden. Cientos de habitantes han optado por huir de sus casas ante la nueva ola de violencia desatada en El Salvador.
Hoy venir a El Salvador es una belleza.
La seguridad ha mejorado bastante, ¿verdad? Ya que nosotros como repartidores podemos ingresar a cualquier colonia.
Yo gracias a él he recuperado mi vivienda, ¿verdad?
La verdad de las cosas, hay seguridad total.
El tema de la extorsión ha bajado de una manera contundente por la toma de esa decisión por parte del señor presidente de la República.
Con buenos son los resultados que se está teniendo porque las extorsiones se han reducido.
Ya nosotros como operadores del transporte, muchos que ya tenemos más de 25 años en este servicio, creíamos que nos íbamos a morir sin antes ver que esta situación a la que estábamos sometidas no iba a desaparecer.
Que se estén abriendo negocios, ese es el verdadero indicador.
Y ya el cliente está incluso aperturando nuevas sucursales, aperturando nuevas tiendas donde antes no podía entrar.
Se ha disminuido la inseguridad ciudadana. Ya no es preocupación de los salvadoreños la inseguridad.
El tema de la inseguridad.
Claro.
Yo siento que ha habido una gran diferencia. Hoy pues ya podemos andar por lugares más seguros y más aseados. Gracias. Le agradezco mucho al presidente.
Yo lo que estamos viviendo es un milagro, sí. Una tranquilidad, ¿me entiendes? ¿Verdad? No tengo palabras. No tengo palabras.
Buenos días, René Escobar, Procurador General de la República.
Good morning, I'm René Escobar. Good morning, commissioners, participants in this hearings, member of the press, Salvadorian people, and international community. As Attorney General of the Republic of El Salvador, by the powers vested in me by the Constitution and by Salvadorian legislation as a guarantor of human rights of people whom we regally and materially present in the corresponding judicial processes, I hereby state the following. That the Attorney General's Office is an institution with broad powers that each one allows us to have a direct relationship with the most vulnerable populations of our country, such as children and adolescents, young people, women, seniors, among others, whom we have helped in guaranteeing their rights and with compliance with access to justice. This exercise had allowed us to understand the scourge that our population has experienced as a result of the serious violations committed by gangs, which were denominated as terrorist organizations by the Constitutional Chamber of the Supreme Court of Justice on August 24, 2015. Disappearances were among the most common crimes perpetrated by terrorist organizations, and the lack of an effective response by the state in the past only aggravated the pain, uncertainty, and lack of justice in a society that had deemed impunity as natural. Crime became a way of life, terrorist organizations involved, such that they not only violated the rights of highly vulnerable groups, but they turned them into their tentacles to carry out their crimes. Unfortunately, many people who were not directly part of these terrorist organizations became involved in criminal activities, absorbed by this perception of impunity, which for many became their livelihood. As Attorney General, I have the constitutional mandate to provide a criminal public defender to those people who are prosecuted for the commission of a crime and who do not have the economic capacity to hire a private attorney. Under the state of emergency, as an institution, we assist almost 80% of people that have been captured to date, most of whom are being prosecuted for being part of terrorist organizations or collaborating in their crimes. I can therefore assure you that although it's true that we are under a special constitutional measure which is focused on ensuring public safety for all Salvadorans, by dismantling criminal organizations that have done so much harm to our country, The administrative proceedings carried out by the security institutions and the Attorney General's office have followed the protocols of action guaranteeing the rights of those detained, and referrals to competent institutions have been effective and timely. We've further verified that the facilities to which individuals have been sent are official and legal for the custody of persons facing criminal proceedings. It is our firm commitment and responsibility for the technical assistance we provide to those deprived of liberty that we receive them via referral from the National Civil Police. They are appointed a lawyer, and we conduct an interview to build the defense strategy, and then continue with the preparation of the case with family members or other authorized persons who provide us with information on their family, work, social groups, and evidence of defense if possible. Thank you to the state for its participation. Now we will give the floor to the commission, starting with Commissioner Jose Luis Caballero. Many thanks. Good morning to all of you. Thank you, Commissioner Julissa Mantilla, Executive Secretary, Assistant Executive Secretary, and greetings to the members of civil society who are with us this morning, and greetings to the representatives of the state. Thank you for your presentations and for being so clear for purposes of our hearing. I would like to highlight a point and then move on to two questions that I have. Questions for the state. First of all, it seems to me that El Salvador is a case that shows us that it should be possible to have, or it's a case study whereby we ought to find a way where you can have public safety with respect for human rights. The issue of ensuring high levels of public safety at the cost of human rights, I think it's a false dilemma. It's an issue we have been working on here along with the Inter-American Court. We're trying to share that perspective. It ought to be possible to have both public safety and respect for human rights. I would like to pose two questions to the state. The first has to do with the October 2021 hearing here, where the Commission observed that there was information on disappearances associated with criminal gangs, but also those associated with militarized police and law enforcement activity. So what would you say as to the presence of military forces doing law enforcement work, and what strategy does the government have to have, what policies are there that ensure proper human rights training for law enforcement officers? The Inter-American Commission has been clear on this point. Police must be a civilian authority, and the use of military forces must be exceptional with appropriate oversight. The second question has to do with the regulatory framework, because I heard that there is a express crime of disappearance. It's with regard to the involvement of a government agent. I'd like to zoom in on the definition that the convention has of forced disappearance in Article 2, because the model, what we want is that the model of that convention to be replicated throughout the region. In that case, in the Inter-American Convention, it says that forced disappearance committed by state agents, but also by people or groups of people who act with authorization, support, or acquiescence of the state, followed by an absence of information or refusal to acknowledge that deprivation of freedom has happened. So I believe this point of the acquiescence of the state, that has been found many cases. I already cited Alvarado. So I would like to respectfully pose that question to the state. And another point that I believe is important in this regard, what is the government doing, or might it be doing, in terms of an effort to ratify the Inter-American Convention on the Forced Disappearance of Persons? And similar provisions in the UN framework. Thank you, Commissioner. I come next, and thank you once again for everyone's presence. And thank you for that context. Of course, the state provides the same background information every single time. I certainly hope that the state will allow us to visit, as we have requested multiple times, because that would be the best thing for us, that we could see firsthand the information that you so kindly provide to us at every single hearing. I have a few respectful questions, and then I'd like to hear from you. The state said that there was not a single report to the prosecutor's office, but I'd like to recall that the state can carry out investigations on its own account, ex officio. The state cannot shed itself of its responsibility to conduct a search. I also heard the state say that it did not recognize the figures or information being provided by civil society organizations. But not recognizing figures of victims doesn't mean they don't exist. It just means that the state refuses to see it. And along the lines of what Commissioner Caballero said, I wanted to specify something, because there are many people watching these hearings here and in YouTube, and we get a lot of tweets. It's important to recall for everyone what disappearance is, because this hearing is about forced disappearance. So disappearance can be caused by individuals. You gave us a lot of information on that. But forced disappearance, as the commissioner highlighted, are those cases where a state agent is involved, a government official, where the victim is taken away, and then there is a denial of information. And that's very important, because when information is not provided, when the existence of something is denied, that is actually part of the definition of forced disappearance. One thing is to not know, but to say it doesn't exist, that's a denial, and that is part of the definition. And I mentioned, because there's an additional issue here, that's the difference, the distinction between disappearance and forced disappearance, and the court has specified this too. One of the main principles of the obligations of the state is due diligence, and that requirement emerges from case law. And what the court stated, that the state is not only responsible if it caused the disappearance. Beyond that, it is also responsible if it doesn't fulfill its obligations to respect and carry out its duties with due diligence. In other words, if it doesn't do everything in its power to prevent it from happening, to investigate when it does happen, to help victims, that's due diligence. So the responsibilities occur not only when it causes the forced disappearance, but also when it doesn't do or fulfill its obligations. And when in cotton fields and in other cases, it was found that there must be strict due diligence when there is a vulnerable group, such as women, and when there is a known risk, a risk known to the state. And we know there's a risk of feminicide. So there's a threshold, a regular threshold, and a higher one. And Linda Loaiza is a case where the higher standard is applied. And before I give the floor to my other colleagues, I want to highlight, I love what Commissioner Caballero said about the false dilemma, but the Commission demands that human rights be respected for everyone. And this is not supporting criminals. This is simply demanding that human rights be respected for everyone. And the scope of responsibility of the state applies to investigation, whether there is an official report or complaint or not. And the role of women in searches, we've seen this in Mexico. It's being discussed. Right now there is a law on this being debated in Colombia. There was a hearing in Brazil, too, where there have been demands for a law of women searchers because it's always the mothers doing the search, and then they end up becoming victims of sexual violence. So let's recall all the instances of international law. And before closing, let's forget that there's a ban on forced disappearances. There, aside from the treaties, whether a government ratifies or not, it's in penal codes, but it's a jus cogens principle. It's something that's above all else, above laws. Governments must prevent, investigate, penalize, and provide reparations. I yield the floor. Thank you, Commissioner Mantilla. Good morning to everyone. I extend my greetings to the illustrious state and the members and representatives of civil society organizations here. I would like to thank the information provided by the state as of October of this year in preparation for this hearing. I'll let you know that we've read everything thoroughly. I'd like to begin also by extending a thanks for the presence of civil society here, because it seems to be a bit risky to overgeneralize and say that Salvadorian civil society, when it comes before such groups to question the state, that they wish to boycott security or that they're part of the opposition. I'd like to recall that thanks to civil society in El Salvador, we have it's just like the Cruz sister, the Garcia Preto case, and a few others cases, emblematic cases that were brought by civil society. So in an international space like this, to accuse civil society of such thing is tricky, and one should be more cautious. As Commissioner Caballero quite rightly said, we have to avoid this false dichotomy. We either are defending the population or we're defending the gangs. That, first of all. And of course, the Inter-American Commission has closely monitored the tragedies and all the impact that criminal activity has had on Salvadorian society. Of course, we recognize this, but we also recognize the absence of the state where there was impunity, where there was no comprehensive public policy. And in the report kindly provided by the state in October, there are references to the strategy as promoting the economy and peace. And given this logic, what is done to prevent crime? Because we're talking about an immediate policy, but what we don't see is where the elements of crime prevention are. The reports highlight improvements to the penitentiary system, but many of those improvements are related to increasing installed capacity of that system. And I echo the call from Commissioner Juntia to be able to visit prisons in El Salvador. We know that there is a mega prison now. We know that prisons were suffering from structural collapse, not just because of overcrowding, but because of the custodial conditions suffered by the imprisoned. So we would also be keen to see where social reintegration fits into policy. But once again, thank you for being here. You said that you provide service to 80% of those detained. So I'll reiterate what I asked in October. Do you have a larger budget than you did 2 years ago? How do you conduct investigations? And how are specific investigations conducted, and how many sentences have been handed out? Because as of October, there were more than 65,000 people detained, and we'd like to know what the flow is, judicially speaking. How's the timeline, and how, just to ensure that due process is happening. Thank you. And now Assistant Executive Secretary Pulido. Thank you very much. It is always good to get firsthand information from civil society organizations and from the illustrious state delegation from El Salvador. I wish to say that the Inter-American Commission has been monitoring the situation in El Salvador for a long time regarding human rights, and has taken note in the country report of 2019 after the in loco visit. It was a report that focused on structural problems in El Salvador, and we've followed advances in public safety. As the commissioner said, the homicide rate in 2015 was 103, and the report says that in 2019, this number had already dropped to 50 per 100,000 inhabitants. The commission took note also of the territorial plan as a policy to address the lack of public safety in El Salvador. And in listening to the civil society organizations today, they said that they did not have much information or knowledge as to what each of the phases of the territorial plan consisted of. That's addressed in the report. As you know, as the Honorable State knows, and civil society as well, the Commission is working on a thematic report on the impact of the state of emergency on human rights in El Salvador, and naturally, the right to life, physical safety, etc., and freedom from forced disappearance have been included. But to have our analysis, we do receive a great amount of information from the state, and we're thankful for that. It's very important to understand each individual phase of the territorial plan, and that is one of the questions that I have. The commissioner referred to 7 phases. In 2017, 3 phases had been implemented according to our count, or by 2019. But what are the further stages from 2019 to 2023? In this period, we've seen more than 70,000 arrests. What percent of these, or what is that regarding the population? What is the profile of these individuals being arrested? What are the profiles of the communities from which they come? What social stratum do they come from? We have been very emphatic in condemning organized crime and gang activity, issued two reports released in Honduras recently on the impact of organized crime against women, children, and adolescents in the Central America's Northern Triangle, and looking at gender violence perpetrated by gangs and the impact on children and young people. And there is a special report on that. And thousands of people have been affected by that widespread violence. That's understood. But the point here that I wanted to raise for the Attorney General, and a system of justice that was managing a much smaller number, 5,000, 6,000 people arrested per year, suddenly 70,000. How can you guarantee individuals' rights, ensure that they know what they're being charged with, to ensure they get individual hearings where they can exercise their right to defense? How do you ensure their access to effective defense? How do you manage the relationship with the families of those detained? These are very important elements for the report that we are working on. And of course, we are at your service and look forward to any information you could provide, as well as information from civil society. That's all it from me. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We will begin our second round of comments. Civil society, you have 12 minutes. Thank you very much, members of the Commission. I would simply like to underscore the fact that the territorial control plan and policy is not been made public. Most of that information is kept classified. The public cannot access it. Again, it is kept secret by state institutions. The organizations here have been spent years, decades working on security, demanding of each different administration a comprehensive approach that includes violence prevention, recovery, as well as victims assistance. We are organizations, in our case, have been around for 30 years, who've been assisting victims of violence, and not just of this administration, but previous administrations. We've also focused on some of these hard-handed policies, some of the restrictions, investigations, and potential negotiations with the three gangs, negotiations that were brought to an end with the current Attorney General. But there have been major milestones as far as violence in the country are concerned. An increase in murders, the 83 in March of 2022. The hypothesis was that this was a result of the breakdown of negotiations between the administration and the gangs. This led to the state of emergency, which has led to thousands of human rights violations. I would also like to note that in 2022, human rights organizations have recorded more than 400 attacks against human rights defenders, and more than 100 committed by state officials. And you heard the image that the commissioner here, representing the state human rights entity, has of civil society organizations. Very alarming. Right now, there are 102 individuals deprived of liberty. Those are estimates because we do not have official data. We would love for them to provide that with us. There are more than 20,000 members of the military in security units, 1,600 persons, as well as more than 300% overcrowding in the prisons. These are estimates that we from civil society have come up with based on tweets that we've seen from the president and the administration. It would be very helpful for us to have access to public information, that they declassify it. When we express our solidarity with victims of forced disappearance, those perpetrated by both individuals as well as members of the government. We would like to be able to support the victims. We ask that the government do that and that the government open its doors to the Commission for an in loco visit. The commissioner said that if information is not official, it doesn't exist, and yet there is no official data. And I think that the state's intervention has been very illustrative. They showed us a lot of news about crimes and forced disappearance, extra legal torture and murders. And the state just clearly denies that this is happening. They stigmatize human rights organizations as well as victims who are suffering because of these state-perpetrated crimes, because they are being labeled as terrorists. We've seen images, things that we're seeing on TV and in the news every day. It's state propaganda. There are no official data, but we can look at the budget. Victims of gang violence, which we have been condemning as civil society organization for years and demanding that the state investigate these crimes, support the victims, and to work with civil society organizations. We have been able to confirm that this rhetoric of, support for victims or populist policies that are part and parcel of President Bukele's discourse. The state of emergency of Cristosal, the information that we provided to you, you can look at the budget items, what is allocated to prevention as well as victim support in 2021 and partly in 2022. The security budget is usually more than $800 million, and there's discussion of increasing that by 20 million. That's for security. That is not the military. This is a different line item. In 2021, the government ultimately executed just $87,000 from the entire security budget line item to victims. And from January to May of 2022, just $79,000 were executed for the Victims Assistance Program. So this is all ultimately overhead for these units. The same is true in the case of prevention. Just 1.4 million executed throughout 2022, and we see this constantly. The current administration, President Bukele's, like previous administrations, have abandoned the victims. They express their solidarity, but the president and state officials have an obligation to meet their commitments. It is civil society organizations to which the burden falls to support victims. There have been nearly 900 cases of persons displaced because of violence, in most cases because of gang violence. We are providing them with support. It's civil society organizations and some churches, but not the state. I also wanted to point out that the systematic violence, it could be considered international crime and could be considered crimes against humanity. These are a result of the most senior level state policies and are targeting a certain sector of the population. We once again express very serious concerns about this to the Commission. Thank you very much. For civil society organizations, we're sad and concerned about some of the statements we heard from the state's delegation, particularly with regard to victims, denying that they are victims and allowing impunity persist means making these cases invisible. As my colleagues have said, a lack of data on disappeared persons and homicides began in 2021. This opaque approach and the failure to share data, for example, from the Office on Prisons, used to share data on those persons who were detained, but it ceased to exist back in 2021. We don't have information on persons who have been murdered or disappeared, either by gangs, and much less so that those who were forcibly disappeared in the context of the state of emergency. The lack of systematic, reliable records about victims, not just in the case of victims of gangs, but what is happening in the context of the state of emergency, are data that do not exist or have not been shared. We do not have specific figures on the number of victims of disappearances by individuals or state officials, or data on those who were forcibly disappeared in the context of the state of emergency. Once again, because of a lack of due diligence by a number of different administrations, the searches always fall on the shoulders of relatives, especially mothers, who head out in search of family members who have disappeared, and they have been mistreated and abused by authorities as they search for their loved ones. I'd also like to express our solidarity with all victims and family members of those who have been disappeared in El Salvador, and mothers who are part of the search block, and COFADE, the mother of Carlos, who disappeared, and Dalia, and Jose Alexander, who also disappeared, Beatriz, the mother of Marcela, also disappeared, Veronica, the mother of Paola, who disappeared in May of 2022, Raquel Salazar, who disappeared in 2019, Cecilia Oriana, who disappeared in April of 2022, Emilia Sanchez, who disappeared in January, Pilar Amontes, who disappeared in September of 2022, among so many other victims who have been disappeared. Civil society organizations will support victims, and we have done so historically. We regret that the representatives of the state have denied this and are not doing what they should to help to identify those who have disappeared, which is occurring within the context of the state of emergency in El Salvador, as well as the situation of those who have been detained under the state of emergency. Every public defender is defending more than 100 individuals, which makes it materially impossible to guarantee access to justice and proper defense, which is a right. The state in this pre-election period refuses to recognize the victims. This is an authoritarian government that violates human rights. We therefore urge the state to stop with this false dichotomy It is possible to guarantee human rights and security at the same time. This honorable commission has so stated as well. We call on the state to fulfill its obligations to exercise due diligence, to recognize the work to search of persons searching for their disappeared loved ones, and to provide reparations. Thank you. You do have 1 minute that you did not use previously, and you have used it up now. The state is hereby recognized. Thank you, Madam Commissioner. We would like to thank you for the questions and the requests that you made, as well as those from civil society. I once again wish to reiterate that the state has had independent meetings with members of the Commission and the Executive Secretariat. We have opened doors for a possible in loco visit by the Inter-American Commission. We've reiterated in those meetings that we need a specific agenda on a very specific topic, as well as all of the topics that you have raised, as well as the type of attention and the support that the Inter-American Commission should provide to victims of gang violence. That is key. We have explained this. We have also provided you with vast amounts of information about each of the phases of our security plan, bearing in mind that all of these plans are very broad in scope. There's a report on each of those phases, as well as all progress that has been made. And that is in response to the question raised by the Honorable Assistant Executive Secretary. We can take a two-pronged approach here. We're trying to state, we're hearing that there has been disappearance of individuals where there is no information available. And I continue to insist, before the state of emergency and now, information was provided to relatives of those disappeared. This is something that is done in an expedited fashion. And that is why we brought the Attorney General with us, who can be much clearer and more precise and speak specifically to how that information is furnished to the families, and particularly information about criminal cases. But that is why we brought the Attorney General, and I will ask him to explain that in further detail. Thank you. The reason that I, as Attorney General, am here is in order to provide real and objective information about what the state has been doing in this case. In our office, we represent different vulnerable communities, young children, adolescents, women, young people, older persons, persons with disabilities. In that regard, we have a holistic view of what's happening in the country. We can look objectively at the impact that this matter has had on security, as well as safeguarding the rights of the most vulnerable in our country. We have a criminal public defender's office, and we have received all of the reports from the National Police in a timely manner so that we can guarantee defense. Each individual who has been detained has been assigned a public defender. What is more, we have been able to see how there have been timely referral of information to the Office of the Attorney General. And those persons who have been detained are detained in official centers. After interviewing each individual who's been detained, we share information with the family members so that the defense strategy can be put together. In other words, communication with the families has been ongoing. It's been effective. And this is with institutions that provide tailored information. We also have a virtual system where in more than 40 occasions, we've been able to discuss the cases with family members. Whenever any report comes to us, we investigate that. We conduct these investigations for each individual who has been detained. I have given these organizations the opportunity to come to our offices and to provide very specific information about specific cases, but they never do. So all of what they're saying is virtually groundless. They have not sought out the competent agencies. We have not received formally reports of any cases that we can follow up on. We, in the office of in our office, we address everything having to do with those deprived of liberty. And in many cases, we've changed the charges or dismissed the charges. That is often at the request of, based on request for judicial review. Criminal organizations, unfortunately, and I say this from a very personal standpoint, we are all victims of organized crime. We have been able to see the major changes in the ability to guarantee rights. For example, internal forced displacement, which has happened, and that was because of violence. Nowadays, there's a culture wherein we see reports of women coming in to request support because they've been held captive by members of organized crime groups. They've been forced to live with them. And in many cases, they've been forced to have children with them. They are coming to us so that we can provide them with timely support. Understand how a state of emergency can change things, but you have to understand the real situation. This state of emergency is focused on organized crime, but not just that. Organized crime as such has made that some types of crimes have diminished in our country, but in some communities have become the tentacles of these groups. And force them to engage in crime, which now we have to shed light on this through legal cases and provide representation to ensure all guarantees pinpoint the perpetrators and do so in an objective way. As an institution, our work is serious, it is objective, and we clearly understand the situation in which we are. There has been coordinated work that we've been doing, and that we are aware that there has to be due process, there must be judicial guarantees, and we're working with institutions, and we can assure you of that.
Para hacer alusión a
To also allude to another point raised by the Attorney General, we'd like to make clear that all individuals in real time have access to information on those deprived of liberty. They can right now go to the website of the PGR, and it's an excellent website that we could show you, and the digital system's amazing. You can ask through WhatsApp where a person is being held. It shows the current state of the trial, who the attorney is, with contact information. That's available. It's publicly available. Now, we understand that for some media outlets, it's much more beneficial to be able to say that there's no type of information whatsoever than to publicize the fact that institutions such as the PGR are guaranteeing rights. There's so many individuals working tirelessly 24/7 to guarantee human rights. And I lament that some of my words get twisted. Human rights organizations, I didn't mean to, I did not say that they are all used as political weapons. No, the work is important, the work that they do, but I'm saying that there are some people that use human rights politically, and that is lamentable, especially at times like these in the run-up to elections, as in the case of El Salvador. So those were some general responses I wish to provide. I'd also like to say that the reports to which the organizations are referring are public information on disappeared persons in El Salvador. And sure, this sounds bad when there are 4,600 people disappeared, but those are what has been reported since 2021, and now based on a report that came out from the police, National Police. I would emphasizing also the request from Commissioner Jose Luis Caballero, I would like to state the following. Laws have the two different crimes: disappearance of persons, that's Article 346, where a public official or authority disappears a person, that's forced disappearance, and then disappearances under Article 148 of the Penal Code, which isn't just to say that the state's legislation does reflect the definitions in the convention. Yes, the convention, thank you. The Ministry of Public Safety also implemented a number of provisions which were approved by the Supreme Court of Justice. This is between 2017 and 2020. Then we have another plan from 2020 to 2023. So this is a protocol. We created an urgent action protocol to address the search and for disappeared people, to also provide an instructional guide to police in the search for disappeared persons. So the police are, in fact, receiving ongoing training in terms of analysis and procedures when there are disappearances. Thank you very much. We are reaching the end of this hearing. Just a few final remarks. We'd like to recall how grave disappearances are. It's a terrible situation. It's not just where the disappeared person is a victim, but that the relatives are as well. And forced disappearance enables other types of crimes to happen, violence, torture, etc. So I appreciate the clarification that the first commissioner made. We had the example of the dictatorship in Argentina, and it changed everything thanks to the active participation of civil society organizations at that time. As to the additional information provided, and please do provide everything in writing, that is of vital importance. There are two different arguments here. There are no complaints and all information is public versus we've filed complaints and gotten no response. So I think it would be good to have further dialogue where the commission could oversee it, ensure that it flows properly. We've discussed this in the past. It's important to recall Article 27 of the Inter-American Convention and Article 4 of the Compact on Political, Social, and Rights, that there are allowances for exceptions, but when an exception goes on and on and on, it's no longer temporary. Certain things can be suspended, but you can't suspend all rights. And in the compact, it says under no circumstances can human rights protections be suspended. So in various instances, there have been meetings regarding visits, and I recall in the last time we met was in Barranquilla, closer to home for me. And I'll reiterate publicly what I said at the time. An agenda with specific points as the rapporteur for El Salvador. I'm here, the whole team is here and willing to go to El Salvador and work with the women who were victims of gangs and talk about those human rights violations. Absolutely, we can develop an agenda. Let's do it. You said it, and I'll repeat it publicly. And as they say in your country, hágale, let's do it. Let's hammer out an agreement. Thank you very much. This hearing is now concluded.